President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with top Mexican officials at the White House Wednesday. They discussed the proposed tariffs on Mexico, which are set to kick in on Monday. President Trump has said on numerous occasions that Mexico must do more to curb the flow of migrants or pay the tariff price. Nancy Cordes has been following the story from Capitol Hill.
Customs officials are calling it a full-blown emergency, fueled by a surge in families trying to cross the border. Since January, roughly 440,000 migrants have been apprehended. That's more than the entire population of Cleveland, Ohio.
Mexico can stop it. They have to stop it. Otherwise, we just won't be able to do business.
In Ireland, President Trump threw down the gauntlet. He vowed to slap tariffs on all Mexican goods next week if Mexico doesn't do more to prevent illegal migration. The tariffs would start at 5% and climb to 25% by October.
And if they go high, the companies are going to move back into the United States. That's all. It's very simple.
But his own party is rebelling.
I'm afraid that it might endanger some American jobs.
Let's hope this doesn't happen.
Mexico is one of America's biggest trading partners. A trade war would drive up the price Americans pay for everything from avocados to automobiles.
Estamos optimistas.
Mexico's president said today he's optimistic there will be an agreement, as Congress threatened to block the tariffs.
I think that this is dangerous territory. This is not a way to treat a friend. It's not a way to deal with immigration.
Does the House have the votes to override a presidential veto on tariffs?
We're not talking about override. We haven't seen anything yet, except a tweet.
A Mexican delegation headed by the foreign minister met at the White House on Wednesday with Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo. White House officials say no deal was struck, and they wouldn't give many specifics, Major, about what it is that they expect the Mexican government to do to stem illegal immigration. They say the meeting was about hearing the Mexican ideas.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much. Natalie Brand joins us from the White House. So, Natalie, great to see you. The meeting's over. From my remote outpost here in New York City, I didn't see anyone or detect anyone run to the cameras. Do we know what came of today's session?
And we were waiting for them to update us on the progress of this meeting. The most information we received, surprise, surprise, is from the president's own Twitter account. Tweeting from his trip at nearly midnight local time, he said this: immigration discussions at the White House with representatives of Mexico ended for the day. Progress is being made, but not nearly enough. Border arrests for May are at 133,000, and that's in reference to some new numbers released by Customs and Border Protection this afternoon. He went on to say that talks with Mexico will resume tomorrow, with the understanding that if no agreement is reached, tariffs at the 5% level will begin on Monday, with monthly increases as he's outlined in his proposal. Now, a White House official tells CBS News that a deal was not the goal of today's meeting, and we have obtained some new details about who exactly was in that meeting. As you mentioned, or as Nancy mentioned, it was the Vice President and the Secretary of State. It was also acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan. And that's because, as we heard a short time ago from Mexico's foreign minister speaking to reporters over at the embassy, he says that migration was actually the focus of today's meeting, not so much talk of the tariffs, but really outlining the migration issue. He did call it a good meeting and said he's optimistic still that a deal can be reached. He's been over the past several days expressing optimism that an agreement can be reached. Again, this is from Mexico's Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard speaking to reporters this evening. So interesting that the U.S. trade representative was not in the meeting today. But again, we know that these talks will continue tomorrow.
Right. The trade representative not there, the Treasury Secretary not there, the key leaders of the president's economic team, in other words, not there. You have a chief diplomat, the Secretary of State, and then you have the acting Homeland Security Secretary pressing the point on immigration and related issues. That in of itself Fascinating. And Natalie, I know it's tough for you at the White House to deal with this because, as Nancy pointed out, and as everyone who's looked at the story well knows, and I'm trying to convey to our audience, there are specifics about the tariffs that may come, but very hard to find specifics from the administration about what Mexico must do, what kind of statistical goals or aspirational goals it needs to meet to alleviate the tariffs. All of this seems to me to be up for negotiation and to be determined at some point later.
Yeah, those details were vague, and maybe vague by design, because administration officials have said, you know, if they want to reach a deal with Mexico, maybe they are leaving some room for negotiation. But we did get some clues today from an interview by trade advisor Peter Navarro speaking on cable shows. He actually indicated that maybe the tariffs won't take effect after all, depending on how these negotiations go. He believes that the White House has Mexico's attention, and he outlined 3 key points that he said the administration, or in his mind, are some of the top priorities. This is per Navarro, saying that Mexico needs to take asylum seekers, so asylum being the #1 issue that he raised, as well as Mexico strengthening enforcement of its southern border with Guatemala, and then also cracking down on what he calls corruption at checkpoints on the Mexico side. So those were 3 key points that he outlined, and maybe those were the talking points mentioned today. Will be interesting to see whether Lighthizer is part of the conversations tomorrow, if the conversations do turn to the trade piece of this. And as CBS has reported, Lighthizer and the Treasury Secretary initially against the idea of these tariffs on Mexico, although the White House now says that they back the president's decision.
And Natalie, I'm glad you raised the name of Peter Navarro, because within the White House, he is quite clearly a trade hardliner, fan of tariffs, believes they work wonders, both economically and as a political pressure point. For him to describe even before the fact that this might not happen, I think is an interesting insight. Meanwhile, a record number of undocumented immigrants came through the southern border in May. That's according to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. And as you mentioned, the president highlighted that in his tweet. This obviously is sort of at the crux of these negotiations going forward.
Absolutely. The administration still saying that this is clearly a crisis with increasing numbers each month. And the latest numbers released shortly before this meeting, or just around the same time as this meeting's about to begin. And I want to show you what those numbers are according to Customs and Border Protection. They say nearly 133,000 people detained at the southwest border and 11,000 turned away. That represents a 13-year monthly high, the highest number of apprehensions since 2006. So this is the backdrop of today's meeting.
Natalie Brand, the North Lawn of the White House, thank you so very much.